Thank you, Hope, and thank you all for joining us for this TMC seminar. It's a special privilege and pleasure for me to introduce Aasim Padela. Dr. Padela is an emergency medicine physician whose work really is at the intersection of health services research, bioethics, clinical ethics, Islamic studies, Islamic bioethics, um, promoting health equity and justice. And I've known Dr. Padela, as have Warren and Brett and others in TMC for many years. And I think, at least in my opinion, if there's one person that I would want to talk to in coming to understand Islam as a substantive tradition and way and community, and how Muslims make sense of medicine and medical ethics and how we should practice and how we should respond to suffering and illness, Aasim Padela would be the first person I'd want to talk to. So he is at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's widely published, and I want to mention that his most recent book is Aasim. I'm going to mispronounce the first word. Maqasid al-Sharia and Biomedicine, Bridging Moral, Ethical, and Policy Discourses, from IIIT Press, which is available for free download. The folks who published it have made it widely available, so you can download the PDF as I did this week. Aasim, it's a really delight to have you with us. Dr. Padela is going to be speaking about Islamic bioethics. What is it? What's it not? And its place in academic bioethics discourse. Welcome.
Thank you, Far, for the gracious introduction and kind invitation to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be with you all to share this talk. As mentioned, there'll be some time for us to have engagement at the end, but also I want to pose some questions, and you can feel free to unmute yourselves or respond in the chat to do so. So let me just launch into this interesting conversation we're going to have. And I want to note for you, one second, that the talk is going to be based on some of the research approach I have that Far kindly mentioned, where I do empirical work looking at how Muslims are influenced by their faith and the way they make decisions in the healthcare system. And then I also do work around sort of how physicians think about Islam as informing their bioethical attitudes and practices. And some of the work that I do is around sort of theological work and how the tradition is used to inform by scholars guidance that is given to patients and clinicians and policymakers. So that's kind of the book you mentioned, is trying to bring those things together at the intersection of the Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. Now, ultimately, my trajectory in the academy has been trying to think about identifying, describing Muslim behaviors so that we can set up Islamic bioethics interventions. Now, you might say, what do you mean by Islamic bioethics interventions? And that could mean for patients and community members how Islam will shape the way they think about their health and creating a culture of health in mosques. Or it could mean that we allow the identity of being a Muslim to be accommodated within the healthcare system, right, which is at times stressed and challenged. And I can talk about that in the Q&A, or just in discourse, like the book that you just mentioned, where we actually allow the tradition, right, of 2 billion plus people of the world to inform in the way in which we care for individuals in the healthcare environment, right? Or the way we think about ethical questions. As you will see at the end, I'll pose that this is a marginalized voice, though it is a huge swath of humanity. So today in our conversation, I hope to have these learning objectives. As an academic, I must sort of say that I hope to give you at the end of this talk, you gain some insights into the discourse of Islamic bioethics. I'll do that by identifying the main actors in the discourse and their outputs, along with some of those limitations. And then secondarily, I'd like you to gain some familiarity with the key concepts and terms within that field of deliberation, particularly, right, so that you can have something to compare to other ways of thinking about ethical questions. And I'm going to talk about the good and the right. And that's where one of the engagements will be, because I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying on that domain. And then lastly, we're going to get insights into the contested space for religion and global bioethics. I'm sure you all know about that, and we're going to pose some questions to think about, as I just mentioned, the moral and social implications of hierarchies within that discourse, which is changing and which can change, and maybe it should change. So the first part is describing the discourse, second is clarifying concepts, and the third part is going to be deliberating and discussing. So let's start just a little bit of a history here. Yeah, I wrote this first paper of mine when I was in medical school in 2005, right? Thinking about Islamic medical ethics. And at that time, I did an extensive literature review, and I thought I'd put something out and I understood what it was about. But then several years later, I hosted a conference, and Farage gratefully came to that conference, where I was posing the question, is there such a thing as an Islamic bioethics? And I had people debate that, and I moderated that debate. So I'm going to present to you a vision that I have, but I'll tell you that this is still something that I'm still grappling with, right? Can there be or can there not be something such as an Islamic bioethics? If you were to ask people in the mosque, right, on the street, Muslims, practicing Muslims, what is Islamic bioethics? They will often say that it is the domain where a physician or a patient asks the question of a religious scholar who then looks at the sources of Islamic law and then renders a judgment, right, in the form of what we would call a fatwa, right, a juridical ruling. I want you to note two things that are happening in this public sort of caricature of Islamic bioethics. One, that authority is, or Islamic authority is in the personage of Islamic jurist, right? And that Islamic bioethics or bioethics here becomes reduced into just a legal opinion. That may or may not be correct, but the point is that is the popular notion, which influences some professional engagement also within this field. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. If you're going to say, as you all are in the academy, well, let's be a little bit scholarly and think about what Google Scholar has to say, right? We don't use PubMed anymore. You'll note that there are many things that will come up, and you don't need to read that list. But you will note that there'll be different disciplinary experts now. We're not moving beyond just a jurist. You have people who have PhDs who are writing on this topic and will be positing themselves as authorities. You have seminarians, obviously, physicians as well, historians, and others. So now you broaden the scope of what Islamic bioethics, if you look that term up, you'll now get not just the jurists, right, issuing fatwas, but you would get other experts and other disciplines coming into the conversation. Therefore, the materials of that, right, of that discourse also changed. So now you have books, journal articles, you certainly have fatwas, but also policy documents and legal statutes. So the idea of what's happening sociologically broadens, right, in the discourse. Now, I will say this notion of juridical rulings being predominant is important to recognize that even in the academy, even academicians sort of still take that route, right? Well, they'll talk about organ transplantation and the Islamic juridical opinions around that. And this is a fatwa review, a paper that was published, it literally went through, and it's small there because the details are important, but there were a lot of juridical rulings from councils and individuals that they tried to analyze. But what happens then, and again, this is an academic article, is that you have some sort of numerology here. Well, the disagreements around fatwas, some said permitted, some said not permitted. And you can see another article just the same, right? Where they say, look at fatwas on organ donation, and they say, oh, all 70 fatwas allow for organ donation. So what you're having happen here is juridical rulings from preeminent individuals or juridical councils are what is then promoted as Islamic bioethics, right? But there's a problem with that, and I'm pointing this out because of the reduction that's happening. That one, in this case, transplantation does not equal donation. They're different moral contexts. Two, numerology does not equal normativity. Whether or not 100 jurists said it's permissible and 2 said it is not, in the tradition, both are actionable if they're based on the scriptural sources. So that's the other problem. So if you say the majority or minority opinion, it doesn't matter for one's action from a Islamic perspective, an ethical perspective. They're actionable, right? But yet even academicians get this wrong. And then certainly fatwas are not all the same weight, right? My local imam versus the grand mufti of Egypt, they're different people with different authorities and different, maybe even expertise. So that still happens within the academic literature. So it's not just in the community space, but in the academic space. Now, I'll also mention here for a second, if we still put all authority in the mind of the jurist, right? Then the jurist often approaches biomedicine and bioethical issues with two constructs. One is darura, meaning there's a dire need, permit something to happen. Someone's going to die, someone's going to become disabled, or maslaha, there's a benefit to be had, right? These are two constructs of the Islamic law. Details are not important for now. But dominantly, if you were to do this sort of fatwa review, you'd find that those are the terms, or those are the constructs that are used. Both render the same judgment at the end, right? That you can do something, either because there's a good, a general good to be had, or there's a threat, so just make it happen. So things like you might say, hey, should we take porcine gelatin, right, within vaccines? Leaving vaccines out, but just say porcine gelatin, right? Well, if there's a benefit that's general and universal, perhaps that would be one way someone would reason through it. Or if someone's going to die, they don't have this thing, then permit it. One's a contingent ruling, the other not. But the point is the result's the same for the community. And they do that because they're dealing with life, or most of the time, they're asked to deal with issues of life and death significance. Now, this is a paper of mine, but what if you were to take that and do it right and say, hey, we're going to have a juridical fatwa review, and we're going to look at what the council say about specific entities. This is just one example of mine, and you're going to take plurality as honest representation of the faith. So you see here about notions of brain death, scholars all over the place, whether it is legal death or not. You just pick a ruling, right? This is one council that said brain death is equivalent to legal death in Islam, and they represent brain death with that verbiage there, that all functions of the brain cease irreversibly and the brain has started to generate. Now you take a legal ruling and you put it into the context of a clinical practice, and you start to find that there are some real questions about how this can be applicable. What are the vital functions? Who decides them? What do you mean by irreversibility? Right? Or what do they mean by irreversibility? Because we know that we can, and have someone sustained with on and be declared brain death, but some of the brainstem reflexes come back. And what do you mean by degeneration? Does anybody look at degeneration? The challenge here is that the application becomes problematic. But then if you were to say the sum total of Islamic ethical thinking is just that, a legal ruling of whether it's permissible, then what happens to all these other things about variability, about implications after brain that's declared, whether there should be exemptions religiously, right? Should informed consent happen? And academicians just think about, or us as public consumers just think about, juridical rulings. None of that's addressed within the juridical ruling. And one would say, well, Islam has nothing to say about that. One might say that. And that's the problem. Another problem of just thinking about legal rulings that are meant to help someone in a situation move forward and stay within the faith. So that said, I want to destabilize the notion of fatwas, but they're a key source of the field. If you think about Islamic bioethics, what you find is that there are many different disciplines engaging in the conversation, but they're doing so in a siloed fashion. Right? There's a little crosstalk. There are conceptual issues with what defines Islamic, what is the scope of bioethics, and then there are methodological issues for us who want to research views on XYZ by Muslim scholars. What are the source materials of the field? I just mentioned to you some challenges with just looking at fatwas, but then how do you obtain policy documents? Right? And what are the methods used to research and develop such materials? How do you say this argument is stronger than that argument, or this policy is more actionable than that policy? For us, I'm a Muslim physician working in the ER. My guild will sort of say that some of the writings are of limited insight into our practice, right? And that there's a crisis of authority regarding Islamic bioethical expertise that plays a role here as well. So people then end up confused. So that's the first part of just giving you a sense of what the discourse is about. I'm going to I deconstructed it, but I'm going to construct it up. But before I do so, I want us to think about why it is this way, right? And how it came to be. So when you think about bioethics, right, oftentimes modern contemporary bioethics, we would say that this, is a new thing, a new field, a new area that came around in 1970, 1971. Two main figures there. You see Andre Helliger's talked about the application of moral philosophy to concrete medical dilemmas, but we had Van Rensselaer Potter arguing that it's something more than that, larger right? That we're going to bridge facts and values related to ecology and life sciences. Who one was the first, and so we became thinking about that moral philosophy to concrete medical dilemmas. Now, when that idea gained prominence within the intelligentsia, within the academy, and started thinking about what are the levels of action analysis of bioethics. And there are many different rubrics here, but I want to share one that there's normative, meta, applied, or descriptive. Right? Or one might say conceptual, practical, theoretical, or conceptual, and other notions as well. But the point was, if we're going to have a field and have a discourse, we need to think about some terms and levels of sort of conversation and then action, right? If we're going to intervene and offer moral guidance, well, what should we do? How do we know what we know? What issues do we pick within the ambit of bioethics? And then what do people do with that? So it became a field, and we professionalized that field, and it started to reside in the academy, right? So multiple different fields of inquiry, multiple sort of methods used. All of this, I'm sure you know, so I'm not going to go through it. So you had conversations about individuals, you had some ideas of what to do, you started to professionalize that field, and then you need to establish it. And how was it established? Through centers, and donors, and funders set up centers outside and within the academy, right? You started to have programs that offered degrees, right? That's the mark of professionalization. So then you can become labeled an expert in bioethics. You then started having books and journals dedicated to this area. And even, right, you had associations, professional groupings come together. This is how you establish a field. And ultimately, then you have to police who's within in some ways, or certify who's within to be able to do some service that you can get money for. And that also happens. So that was bioethics, right? I'm giving you a broad Aasim Padela, somewhat sort of odd characterization of what has happened in the last 50 plus years. But back to the Muslim context, that field then goes into the Muslim world. And what we have then is that we not only had the biotechnology and the way to practice medicine, right, come from the so-called West to the Muslim world, but we were taught how to not just do medicine, but how to solve problems within medicine. Within these institutions, some of you might recognize those pictures, Bahrain, Qatar, right, Dubai. And someone characterized this as educational imperialism and missionary bioethics. So we taught you, right? And I'm going to use that term specifically, taught you how to be people who can practice healthcare as if nothing existed before. And then we're going to tell you when problems occur, how to solve them because you know nothing prior to that. And that model of engagement is what happened to the Muslim world, right? And Islamic scholars, they said, okay, well, let's think about what to do. We're going to react, right? So the visitor model is that react to developments from the West. That's where the technoscience is being developed. That's where the leading centers of bioethics are. And the way to preserve, right, our morality is to have jurists who are thinking about legal action with afterlife ramifications to be engaging with them. Right? So that's what happened, that we have to issue legal fatwas to respond so that we can remain within the faith. And then the academicians became reporters of that, right? So that's why the fatwa, in a certain way, gained a lot of prominence. And you had scholars who would write about fatwas, right? This is one of the landmark reports of the field from Egyptian fatwas. And then this is a more recent one, right, where you have two scholars from Saudi. Look at the title, Contemporary Bioethics, Islamic Perspective. So you had, this is the field, we're going to put Islam within it. And what are they reporting on? They're reporting on juridical council rulings. Another model of engagement that also happens within the Muslim world, and I'm saying Muslim world globally here, is the lay professional model, right? So now, yes, we have juridical rulings, but we have to respond to the practical concerns of Muslims in large society. And as I said, there's a space there, right? How do you practice? Do you have a legal ruling, but how does that come to my practice? So then these bioethical concerns were addressed by clinicians and public intellectuals, trying to fill that gap. And academicians were then the critical commentators on that material. So physicians say, hey, well, there's a scriptural verse here. This is what we take, and now let's just move forward, right? Save a life when life is at risk, do whatever you have to do. Or other things like this, where they would try to create a space for authority, but to respond to people who are facing crises, not using legal rubrics, but just scriptural sort of ideas. The challenge with that, right, is, and I'll share with you, this is a large survey I did, but just a point, the challenge with that model where clinicians are responding was that there's significant knowledge gaps. So this is a national survey I did in 2013, funded by the Templeton Foundation of Muslim Physicians from the Islamic Medical Association of North America. So an organization where Islamic identity is at the forefront, and they're physicians. And you ask them, well, how familiar are with Islamic bioethics? You see 85% reported they were somewhat or very familiar, right? How does this influence your practice? Nearly 60% said it somewhat or greatly influences my practice. And they were religious people, right? Almost 90% reported that Islam was a very or most important part of their life. So a very religious sample who perceives Islamic bioethics to be very important to their practice. But when you ask them, okay, well, what do you do when you're faced with a bioethical dilemma? You will note here in the hours there that the most common resource they was another physician. And they sometimes can consult another physician, another Muslim physician, almost 50%, right? But imams, local imams, sometimes there, but juridical councils, legal rulings, never. Look at that. Over 50% of we never read any of that stuff at all. So the lay model became, well, where are they getting their Islamic guidance from? So you see now you have a, a distance, a disconnection between juridical rulings, right? And then the lay Muslim clinicians are trying to respond. And that comes from, right, this larger question that remains one that I still think about today, that when you put this term together, Islamic bioethics, well, what is the Islamic that we mean? Is it an Islamic spin on contemporary bioethics, as that book notes, or is it really an Islamic ethical frameworks that can then be applied to biomedicine? Right. So we're not just inserting ourselves to give a legal ruling, but rather we want to think about what Islam as a tradition thinks about, how it thinks about ethical issues, and then what would that mean for a biomedicine? So where does that Islam come from? There are many different views on that. What is the register of bio that we're addressing, and what is ethics? So that's the space within which I've tried over the last 2 decades to try to give some foundations for people who want to engage in the discourse, where I know that it is a discourse that arises from trying to use the Islamic tradition with a larger tradition, not just the legal, to address small questions and ethical issues arising out of these fields. There has to be a dyad where there's someone representing the medical field and someone representing the religious field, so to speak. But there are other disciplinary experts all around that. So you'll see this sort of figure that I present often. It's in one of my first books, Medicine Sharia, where I say this is where Islamic bioethics resides. That you have in the blue there, teal there, that moral machinery of Islam, right, grounded within multiple different moral sciences, Islamic law being one of them, theology being another, and sort of practical and pietistic ethics being another. But these are the moral sort of fonts that we draw upon to then address questions coming out of those sort of shaded red boxes, clinical practice or health policy issues. But yet to understand them fully, we need to engage with those darker gray boxes, right? Social sciences, biomedical sciences, and contemporary philosophy ethics. Why is the question posed in this way, for example? What do these terms mean in the practice? Those can be only answered by disciplinary experts from those fields. And when you bring them all together, then you can render something that would be an Islamic bioethical position statement, for example, right? That it moves beyond, and this is not Aasim Padela's idea, but this is actually when you think about the Islamic tradition, this is how deliberation used to occur, right? Not just a reactive modality. So what's Islamic about Islamic bioethics then? I addressed that by saying it has to be tied to the scriptural sources and bears of the tradition. That there is revelation which distinguishes Islam from non-Islam, and that they're interpreters of that revelation. They must be brought into the fold, right, to have something that is labeled Islamic. And it draws ideally from several sources of morality. I mentioned those just a slide ago. The terms are not that important. I did put this thing about maqasid because that's the book that just came out, but nonetheless, I want to tell you that you have to draw from those different sources. But what is it not? And it is not Muslim bioethics, right? The sociological study of how Muslims respond to ethical challenges with one input as Islam. So that's what it's not. And it is not this, and I'll get back to this picture in a couple slides. So the principal producers then of Islamic bioethics as a discourse are multiple: jurists, clinicians, academicians, social scientists, right? And all these others here that it is all these people who are engaging in a discourse, and their textual outputs are different. Right? So for someone engaging in the field and wanting to understand what so-called Islam has to say, you need to do some work and gather all these sorts of material. But the importance is that the consumers that are also multiple, right, at different levels, right, from patients and their decision and surrogate decision makers, clinicians, religious leaders, hospital healthcare systems, academicians, and Islamic bioethicists, meaning that it is a global discourse with many sort of stakeholders here. So moving kind of, to a couple concepts, and then in the end, I'm gonna post questions for engagement. So the concepts I want us just to think about, right, since this is a TMC sort of Duke Divinity School audience here, that these are things you study all the time, right? What is good and right, or might have, what is good and right, and why is it so? So can someone tell me the debate around that in your terms from your tradition?
That's not just a rhetorical question, y'all, if anybody wants to answer.
It's one person, so you can put it in the chat. Okay. I'll answer given time. But the debate occurs. This is in the sense that, well, in many ways, what does that mean for the action itself? Is there a quality of goodness within it, right? Or is it simply a labeling by an authority structure, right? So this classic problem within Greek, Muslim, other Islamic religious philosophies. Right? Is it just the legislator labeling that something's good, or is there an inherent quality within an action? And then the second question that also influences Islamic values is, does God legislate for human benefit? And the questions there as well, if there is that case, must he do so? And if he has to do so, must he do so? And if he does so, right, regardless if he has to or not, can we understand what those benefits are? So these are the classical questions that relate to the difference between divine command theory and what we'd call theistic subjectivism today. And they influence Islamic moral frameworks as well. There are different views on these matters, which have epistemic implications for the role of reason in ethics and law. So when you're building up an Islamic bioethics, you must tackle these head on and make make it clear whether you think reason starts when revelation ends to discern the good, or does it help calibrate rulings, and whether there is or there doesn't have to be a rational basis for every rule. I say that because when we think about today's bioethical circles or public reason, right, and how we engage in conversation in the clinical ethics in the hospital system, it's based on these notions that are often not talked about. So how would a Muslim engage in that conversation is something that I often quiz my students around. I want to give you something. This is a verse. I'm sure many of you can't read that verse unless you know Arabic, obviously. But what I want to share with you is something to think about here. In this verse, the Quran, God says, they ask you about wine and gambling. Say in the twain, in both of them, there is a great sin, and the benefits for humanity. That's the first line there. The second line says, the sin in both of them is greater than the benefit in both of them. So that phraseology is taught to us in the seminary. Say, hey, look, what is being weighed here? We know that there is a prohibition in gambling and in wine drinking. So then God is telling us that there's sin in them, but one sin in both of them. There might be benefits. The verse even says there are benefits, but the sin outweighs the benefit, meaning that how do you think about reason here? God tells you what's sinful, and that's the end of the story. Whether you think about human benefits, you can aggregate them and we can do analysis, it doesn't matter, right? There's a strong inclination here that your reason cannot outweigh what you're told by revelation. So it's not consequentialism. We don't sum up what's good or bad and then think about it. And it cannot be unbounded reason for an Islamic morality. So the end goals for Islamic bioethics practice move from what can I do to what should I do, from the legal permissibility, which is what we often focus on, to what is the optimum, the perfected optimum of how to be in the world. And we have to connect the production of good to being good, right? So the agent, the action, and the intention must all be in sync that would be what Islamic bioethics would be, which is why I mentioned those three fonts, right? Not just law. Law is just about the action and is wholly God-centric. So now with the few minutes I have, if we open up to question and answer, I want to post for you something that I've been thinking about for a little while, but now I have some deeper thoughts to share with you and to stir the pot. So we know in the American context that religion is special, right, in biomedical discourses, and one could say generalize that to the West writ large, right, where you have this dividing line between science and religion, where science is the realm of certain types of things, rationality and universal claims, while religion might be, more parochial claims and special or magical thinking, according to some. I'm not saying that. But here we have this notion beyond rationality, right? There's an epistemological claim that religion is the realm of scriptural arguments. Those arguments are not based on public reason, and that there's inaccessible and intangible truth claims, right, that are based on some ontological philosophical schema. They're not based on empirical reality, right? And therefore, we need to have this line and demarcated. Yet in the American context, we have this ambiguous legal context of the First Amendment. We have the Anti-Establishment Clause and also the Free Exercise Clause, which leads to very interesting conversations here in the States that don't occur elsewhere. And in the States, as a leading producer of technoscience, of biomedical sciences, and of bioethical discourse, this kind of has a role to play in how the rest of the world responds. So globally, right, we have conversations in global bioethics that religion should have nothing to do with bioethical discourse. And these are snippets from an A-Job special issue a few years ago. We have journals literally saying that we're not going to accept religious-based articles in our journals. This is a journal of Developing World Bioethics, which would be interesting, since most of the developing world would adhere to some religious background. And they said, as I said, explicitly, right? They don't fall in the category of public reason, so therefore this is not some worthy of our discourse in this journal. This came to head recently at the World Congress of Bioethics that occurred in Doha, Qatar, and you'll see the subtitle there, Religion, Culture, and Global Bioethics. There were both issues of what's happening, why are we doing this in Doha in a Muslim country, but then also issues on why is bioethics, why have to do anything with religion? What's the second subheader here, right? So you have people sort of raising questions again in special issues of bioethics and A-Job. And you had respondents saying, well, maybe a way to get this conversation aligned is by posing the question of diversity. Shouldn't we have diversity of views within bioethical discourse, right? Isn't diversity a held value of the West, so to speak? And you'll see, this is the former president of the IAB, she said about diversity. She's pluriversity, and she gave a keynote talk at that World Congress, right? Diversity is the path through which we can have conversations around religion, but in this case, it was specifically around Muslims and Islam. We recently had a special issue dedicated in part in A-Job to bioethics today, results of the views in the bioethics server. Now, I want you to note something here. The title, right? Bioethics Today. Who do they survey? 824 US bioethicists. If I were I am a researcher, I'm a vice chair of research, by the way, I would say never make that title. Why? Because America is not the world. When you look at that methodology, how do they decide who the bioethicists are? Well, you have to have gone to the ASBH in these 2 years, or be affiliated with a program that has a master's, PhD, or fellowship program in bioethics. Okay, that's a methodology, but look at the who is there in that conversation. So this is American bioethicists and bioethics, right? Large B. In terms of the religiosity, you see over 30%, nearly 30% were religious and Christian, 14% Jewish. There's one sole Muslim. It's not me. I know what that is. But that is the sum total of Muslims in bioethics from an American perspective. And in terms of religiosity, you see a better spread here, right? Some are highly religious, better not. So that's almost a normal bell curve. So that's the United States. Go to abroad. So this is a conference I was at in Poland, a European society there. And the title of that conference was Diversity in Bioethics. At that 3-day conference, there were 2 people, me and someone, Muhammad Ghali, who were from a Muslim background. And one of us didn't present on anything related to Islam. So again, right, that was the window, the door, diversity. And I know this is a term that we want to maybe excise in our discourse, but it was interesting that even the stated values, right, which is the way that some argue to have Islam and Muslims and religion included, doesn't hold true in the practice of that. If you think about endowed professorship chairs at leading bioethics centers, now I'm talking particularly in Europe and the US, right, which are promulgating bioethics around the world, there's none focused on religion in terms of Muslims. In terms of the editorial boards, you can see here in the top 10 bioethics journals, there's me on a couple, and there's another person from Iran on one. And in the Haystack Center, I started this talk talking about how you establish bioethics. There are over 200 fellows. There are 3 people who have a Muslim background. I'm not saying anything about speaking from an Islamic lens. I'm simply saying I have the demographic of being affiliated with the religion of Islam. So it doesn't seem to me that that's actually also held value. So it's more like, right, that we are homeless guests in a conversation around bioethics. We're invited in to go spend some time at the academic centers and have conversations, but then we have to go out somewhere else and find a home and domicile. So my argument, and I said this is going to be provocative. So what's my argument? Where should Islamic bioethics reside? Well, if this is the caricature, it ain't going to reside anywhere in where I'm staying here or at your university, because that picture is of a conference I attended where that's what the advertisement was. And who would come to that? It seems that Islamic bioethics is for people in some other world, a developing world nation, who look like that. It has nothing to offer us in the academy, right? So I would argue that it is not from Muslims and Muslim lens. I would hope that you think about this tradition of over 2 billion people and has over 1,400 years history, as there's something to be said about Islam that can inform humanity at large about the way to think about things that are ethical. That it can be a vocation for individuals at universities or consultants in the industries around the world, or even religious advisors in communities. And then where would it be? Well, I'm not quite sure, right? It could be anywhere amongst that, in the religious studies, area studies, schools of divinity, academic medical centers. But wherever bioethics is, there should be some Islam there. And I have at one point argued that there should be centers bridging that, but I don't know at this point. And so I ask you for that conversation. In the end, one might say, if you don't have a conversation on ethics that doesn't include Islam, a tradition of a civilization that still exists today, I wonder if you have any notion of what ethics is, or doing justice to any degree program. So I will stop there, and I would love to have conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Padela, and thank you for leaving some time for questions. I'll remind participants that if you use the Q&A function, it should be at your bottom right. You can submit a question, and welcome you to do that now. I have a few questions, Aasim, that have been on my mind as you spoke. It's a remarkable vision you've given us. I'm curious, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I know, were hoped to see more going on in Islamic bioethics in the US where you are. And it seems, and I'll ask this as a question to you, has that vision, I mean, has what you'd hoped for been realized, notwithstanding all the problems that you've highlighted?
Certainly, I think that there is more discussion and discourse happening. If you look at a trend, in my early days, I would put this bibliographic analysis that was on the show, like over 50 years, 140 papers on Islamic or Islamic bioethics, right, from until 1996. But if you look at that next period of the last 25 years, you would probably say tripled, right?
Yeah.
The amount of publications drawing upon the tradition, trying to converse, right, with the audiences around this, not just located within some Muslim journal in Malaysia, I'm saying in our journal. So there is more conversation happening. And I think that people on the ground level, the Muslims who are looking for guidance, are finding that there are schools and scholars and jurists who are more familiar to address their issues, right? Because they're almost existential crises. What can I do? Those life and death issues. And the vocabulary is a little bit more nuanced than it used to be. Certainly there's positivity. But the last part of my talk was, is there a home in the academic bioethics, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that question I haven't answered.
Gotcha. Let me, and it's an important question. And I don't have an answer for it either, but I see in the data you've displayed uh, the the ground as it lies currently, which is, as you noted, is pretty spare. Um, and but I with all of the laypersons being, as the physicians say, the first person they turn to is a colleague. There are people writing books, kind of like we've seen. I'll just say in Christianity, certainly in the evangelical Christianity that's been part of my formation, people coming up with books and writing how-to books, and there's not really a strong need to have some kind of imprimatur or disciplinary training. Um, in and I realize the tradition is not univocal. I mean, it's like, but in your sense, how much is it a problem? And I'm asking you, thinking as a Muslim, but as one committed to being faithful to God, and as you understand it in Islam, how important is it to work toward removing, so to speak, unexplained variation in people's different rulings? And how much is it within the tradition just it's okay, that's a feature of being human. The point is to go through the practices, to submit to the orders and the norms and the communal practices by which you come up with a ruling, and whether they all agree is not that big a deal. I'm curious your thoughts about that.
Yeah,
Because I'll just say Christians, this is a Christianity focused initiative you're graciously speaking to, and I think we struggle with those questions.
yeah, and for the audience, I'll say, there are different views here within a more hierarchical, authoritarian Shi'i world, right? And then the Sunni world, where there is more of, we make the joke that there will be the Protestants of Islam, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But if you take both of them together, all of them, none of them claim, right, that there is except for certain matters, creedal matters, uniformity necessary, right? The policing the boundaries, okay, do you believe in God? Do you believe in the Prophet? Do you believe in the last day? Those three things, okay, you're in the house of Islam, right? Juridical rulings about how to live your life can be varied, right? I'm giving you that would be the caricature of what Islam is. That's agreed upon across. Now, as we said, rulings about whether you can have this or have that might be different and can be different. Now, your relationship to the authoritative structure you've asked you might say this is the best or most important thing for me. I'm going to do it. Otherwise, I feel sinful. But that's your own feeling, right? That's not necessarily you're going to be held liable for. And so for me in the Islamic Bioethics discourse, at the leading edge of this discourse, I don't think there needs to be uniformity. I think there needs to be clear process, as you mentioned, right? That you're relying upon authoritative structures who are doing reasoning exercises that are within the bounds of how we reason, do hermeneutical exercise within the scripture. It's a rational epistemology. It is not an irrational epistemology. It's interesting what people say religion is science, right? But how does scripture come to you? Through testimonial knowledge. You have to, right? I mean, that's how we get where no one's doing magical thinking, right? At this point, at least in my tradition, I know about,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
we base authority based on how did the Quran come to us? How does Hadith come to us? And so it's a rational epistemology. It isn't, okay, I'm getting revelation right now. That's not happening.
Okay. There's a few questions have come in here. I've got several more if we get to them, but probably won't. But let me turn to one of our guests today, who asked, for Muslims in the Western world, what are the main areas of conflict between religious conviction and healthcare? This includes medical practice, research, pharmaceutical development. I'm thinking primarily of an average Muslim patient navigating personal healthcare in the U.S. What are issues that might cause them a conscience issue?
Yeah,
Question.
yeah. So I've done some empirical work here, areas that are challenging for Muslim communities. And as you asked me, as a standard Muslim in the community, there would be issues around end of life care, right? So the good death versus the managed death. Um, all right. And you have issues around, again, terminal sedation, all that stuff. But my point is that's one domain. Another domain would be uh, on gender relationships and how that works, right? And then, so that would be another, and that's particularly because the way our system's set up, right? It is not like in, Pakistan or Saudi or else where there are sort of gender segregated wards. And then the third area, which that people find challenging, is reproductive health, broadly
Mhm.
speaking. And I'll say for two reasons, which might resonate with the audience here. One, yes, there's questions around how IVF can be used and what the stage of birth and all abortion, all that stuff. But I think the larger question um, is human reproduction a right, or is this given as a grace from God? Is the person who's infertile diseased, or is this the lot that God gave you? And that is an increasing concern because people then feel less than others. Why aren't you using XYZ? Right? And is your child a gift to be, right? Whatever the state of the child is, this is what God has given you. Or actually, we should do something so that that child is not born. If you can, I'm foreshadowing the
Yeah.
conversation. Right?
Yeah.
That I think it resonates probably with this audience, but that's a real problem for people because we have declining mortality, I mean, fertility across the world, and we have delayed XYZ, and now it's like, what am I supposed to do? So that's an area of a lot of uh, emotional turmoil. If I can, Far, I'll say something else. So now you asked me with the ground, but I'll say as a human being, as someone at the thinking these sort of theological philosophical spaces, I think what is medicine for, right? I think the epistemic reductionism, the philosophical sort of naturalism of what medicine has become is a big problem for all our ethical traditions and for mine. And
Mm.
I'm really concerned that tomorrow's doctors are just going to be our technicians, not moral sort of deliberators. And they're going to be doing whatever the patient wants that we can pay for. Um, and there will be no moral exercise there. And that's what deeply concerns me because that is not a feature of what this used to be as a moral practice and not what people go into it and not what certainly Islam would say would be healing to humanity.
So let me use that as a bridge to another question a participant put. And the bridge is, it seemed that, as you suggested, that maybe people in this call, people in your community, um, could be co-belligerents, if you will, against this kind of uh, materialistic reductionism. But um, the question is, you'd mentioned that Islamic bioethics should not simply be for Muslims, but for all humanity. How much does conversations around interfaith dialogue influence your vision for Islamic bioethics? And I guess that to tie it to my bridge, do you see kind of that self-conscious co-belligerence potentially being in that constructive way, being a fruitful possibility?
It's certainly, I wouldn't maybe use the word religious. I think that offering, so in the way that I imagine moral communities can ally is around things, as I said, where there is truly an agreement, right? But our responsibility is skirted when we don't voice anything. And my arc of my talk was just this: look, you want to be allies? Well, where are we? Which door are we through? Well, we can resolve our issues in the community space, right? We can get a jurist to answer the question, move forward. But you will have no voice. And we are going to harm ourselves and society larger if we do not bring into the conversation those with the different views. I'm not saying just Muslim, I'm saying Buddhist, whatever, where there might be an ability to then say, hey, look, this is the wisdom of traditions. These are the challenges of inhabiting this techno-scientific based metaphysical reality. And we want you to be aware, want you to be aware of that, whoever the policymakers are and the structures are, right? Where are those people in medical schools? I teach a course here called Between Bioscience, Philosophy, and Theology,
Mm.
where we talk about the human being. And I said, yours different. And I say, we bring people in. There are different views on the human being. Where are we going to have those conversations? Because the human being is just a machine. That's what they're fed. So that's my concern that the door was open, isn't open, who knows? But I would say Muslims would be skirting our moral responsibility if we don't have dialogue with others and say, how do you reason sharp? Tell me, understand. Because this world is not a world that we're all in the same boat. If it drowns, we all drown. And I would say the same to the other group, right? I mean, we are all going to drown. And then at the end of the day of judgment, I mean, if I can use that, God will ask all of us, what did you do? If we felt we were that, I gave you guidance. What did you do? Who did you partner with to make sure that people weren't going to tear the boat apart and drown? That's my view. So I think there is, but not forced. And not, oh, we don't, yeah, we're just here together and sing kumbaya. But the reality is, I think we're skirting our moral responsibilities when we don't dialogue. And and it's not against them. I'm saying all of us are not doing it.
Um, you guys are seeing one of the things I appreciate about Dr. Padela is his moral seriousness about these things. It's not just arm's length, dispassionate sociological observation, but and that I think rings true to Aasim, what you have taught about the tradition being a serious one as well about living well and faithfully together. Um, the a question was put, maybe it's a basic question, but probably good to address. Christians often start their discernment with a close read of Scripture. Is it safe to assume that the Quran plays a similar role in Islamic and Muslim discernment?
Yes, I mean, certainly. So in the Islamic tradition, we think of the Quran and the Sunnah as a single revelatory event. That's what defines Islam, if you were to ask a theologian, right? So the meaning that the Quran is a scriptural text and the actions, doings, and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad were also part of the same revelatory event. So one explains the other. So that you cannot understand, this is the standard view. You can't understand verse of the Quran in living, inhabiting without the example, which is the Prophet, right? What does that mean? To be, if for taking, for example, virtues, right? How are you forbearant? How are you, what? Because that's the example. So the lived in accordance to the scripture is his example. So for us, it is not just, okay, yeah, pick up a verse, right? You always, okay, if you take this verse, even about how to make ablution before you pray, well, how did the Prophet do it? He says, the Quran says many places pray. He says, pray. He says, pray as you see me pray, because I'm the example for you. It just says pray. So that's the symbiosis there. So for Muslims, it would be, yes, a close reading of scripture, but now you're taking scripture as both the Quranic text and the example of the Prophet Muhammad.
Which there's writings about that example, right? That
Yeah.
kind of come along,
So
passed down with the text.
That's correct. So his example is codified by the early community who saw him. So you have books, canonical books of hadith, which capture what he did, what he said, and so on and so forth. It's not I mean, we have the biography too, but I'm simply saying which is considered scripture, right? So this is how he did things. This is what he said. Much like I would say, like the way the Bible sort of has books and chapters, and they're right, come through certain lines and lineages. Both we have that as well for the tradition.
Okay. Um, Brett, feel free to turn on your um, video and turn off there you go.
No,
Brett has
I just so enjoy this conversation. Thank y'all. Awesome to your reply to the question before. I so appreciate what I took you to be named as a kind of the urgent need for kind of post-secular collaboration between robust moral traditions in the face of the kind of uh, vitiation and just kind of bleaching out of moral commitments in much of our modern world and in healthcare in particular. And so if I too fear that moment of eternal judgment and that question being asked to me as a Christian, like how can I best support you, or Christians like me support you in more deeply living into your own Muslim commitments and seeking to more morally practice in the world of healthcare?
Great question, Brett. Um, So I think what I'll leave the audience with is
he
two
could
things, right?
raise some money and found some bioethics chairs in
Okay,
Islamic
sure.
tradition.
There you go. There you go. Let's do that. Um, but the reality is, in healthcare, we see human beings, and so I think at the one level is that I have conversation. I'm a minority, right, background here, but when people have these sorts of questions and concerns, I'm responsible for helping them find a space to have that conversation, but then giving them resources for that. So I think all of us can do that, right? Meaning, is there a local Muslim chaplain? Is there an imam that we can talk to? Is there a community? And don't make them feel ashamed about their religious issues that they bring, right? Or their concerns about what's happening. Well, what do I think about that? I think we have to acknowledge that as people who have some moral compass that thinks about the afterlife, right? And have a different vision of the human being than just a biological machine. I think for most, so that's general. The second I think I would offer is that we need to do what I just sort of said, right? If we have stated values, for example, diversity, for example, we are representing bioethics, we need to check ourselves. We cannot have dialogue and say, okay, we're going to do that at the exclusion of the tradition. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. And now at this point, I don't really tolerate it, which is where you're getting me, right? I mean, people spend the entire Western intellectual history, and like there was never any engagement with Augustine, with any of the Muslim writings. Nothing happened in the Muslim world. How can you have a degree from an institution on theology, on religious ethics, and never have studied anything to do with the Muslim tradition? I think that is horrible, and we have to call that out. And that's the systematicity that I have a real big problem with. Same thing with these notions of diversity, right? So we can point to them, where's religion diversity? But even the religious groups exclude. They call courses religion and medicine and have nothing to do with Muslim tradition. That's abhorrent to me. And that's against our own values. I think we point the fingers at ourselves if we do that. I would never do that as a minority. I think the majority sometimes have that privilege. So again, raw, but I'm telling you, that's the ethical responsibility for people in this sort of conversation, that we cannot systematically exclude, because that's a detriment to us as a moral communities who are going to be asked in decision. But then you force people to say, okay, you have nothing to offer us either. So let us go and retreat in our own silos and be done with you, and to the detriment of all.
Thank you, Dr. Padela.
Yeah, I had one more pragmatic question, but I think it's best to leave things there with that word from Dr. Aasim Padela. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next TMC seminar.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.